Welcome to the Rational Mind. Today we're looking at arguments based on observation, which is chapter 1.4 in the OCR A-level religious studies specification. So, a quick recap. Ontology, which is what the ontological argument is, which is an argument based on reason, is the branch of philosophy which explores the nature of existence. So the ontological argument claims that by thinking about the definition of God and its implications, we can work out through reason that God must exist. And the person that came up with this was St Anselm, and this is the argument we're going to be looking at and criticising and responding to. So it's an a priori argument, and it depends on logic rather than sense experience, and we're going to look at these definitions in more detail as we go through. So before we go into the definitions and the rest of the arguments and the other philosophers, take a pause of the video and see whether you can define these keywords. Here are the definitions. So ontological is to do with the nature of existence. A priori arguments are arguments which draw conclusions through the use of reason. And again, we're going to look at this in more detail later on. A-posteriori arguments are arguments which draw conclusions through the use of experience. Contingent is depending on other things for its existence. Necessary existence is existence which does not depend on anything else. A predicate is a term which describes a distinctive characteristic of something. A deductive argument is the conclusion necessarily follows the premise, and if the premises are true, then the conclusion must follow. An inductive argument is that the conclusion follows from the premises. If the premises are true, then the conclusion may likely lead to a probable conclusion as well. But it's not necessary. And again, we're going to look at this later on. An analytic argument is that the truth, or its falsity, of an analytic statement is completely determined by the meanings of the words and the symbols used to express it. Whilst for a synthetic argument, the truth or the falsity cannot be determined solely by the definition of its arguments. So we're going to look at a priori arguments in more detail now. So some people argue that a priori arguments are more persuasive because they rely on deductive logic. So if the premise are true, then they lead to certainty, and the arguments therefore have to be true. And examples of these include maths, or any terms of maths, but 1 + 1 = 2 is an example you can use that's quite simple. Or definitions such as all bachelors are unmarried men, or any other definition that you'd like to use. Whilst a posteriori arguments are a bit different. They can only lead to strong probability because they rely on sense experience, and new evidence or a better explanation could be found. However, they might be a bit more persuasive than a priori arguments, some people might argue, because people can see the evidence for themselves using their sense experience. So for example, if I say it's raining outside, I can use my eyesight in order to see whether it is raining outside. So the statement can be either true or false. If I look outside and I see that it's raining, then the statement is true. But if I look outside and see that it's not raining, then the statement is false. So my use of my senses in a posteriori argument can be more persuasive. Or all swans are white. If I've only ever seen white swans, then I would think that there are only white swans. However, it's false because there are black swans that also exist. So this might be used to illustrate that my eyesight might not actually be that reliable or not as persuasive because I would have to see a black swan in order to know that not all swans are white. And now moving on to analytic arguments. An analytic proposition is true by definition and needs no experience or evidence to support it. So very similar to a priori arguments. So again, all bachelors are unmarried men is the main, or other definitions are the main examples you can use here. Whilst a synthetic argument is obviously the opposite of an analytic argument. So it needs evidence and experience to support it. So for example, the car outside my house is red. So I can go outside and see whether the car is red or whether it's blue or another colour. So again, a synthetic argument doesn't necessarily have to be true. It can be false as well. And now on deductive arguments. So deductive arguments are very logical. So premise 1, bachelors are unmarried men. Premise 2, Sam is an unmarried man. So conclusion, Sam is a bachelor. And this is what a deductive argument is. And it's the logic that Anselm tries to use for the ontological argument. And it seems quite reliable and quite persuasive because there is no gaps in logic in between here. It's very rational. Whilst an inductive argument is a bit different. If I say premise 1, cats have tails, Sam has a tail, so therefore Sam is a cat, does this necessarily have to be true? Sam could be a cat, yes, so it could be true. But he could also be a cow, or a horse, or any other animal or object or anything that has a tail. So therefore the premise doesn't necessarily have to be, if all the premises are true, it doesn't necessarily mean that the conclusion has to be true. I would have to use something else, my sense experience, such as my sight, in order to see whether Sam is in fact a cow or any other animal. So now on to St Anselm's ontological argument. Anselm lived in the 11th century and was a Benedictine monk who became an Archbishop of Canterbury. And his argument was written for faith-seeking understanding, not as an attempt to convert unbelievers. So he made reference to the fool who does not understand that God must exist, and his famous quote that you can use is, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." And this is the logic that he then uses. So his first form, his first argument, which is the ontological argument, the original ontological argument, is as follows. Premise 1. God is the greatest conceivable being. Nothing greater can be conceived. This is the definition of God that he uses. So you need to know this very well, and in order to illustrate what it is, because all the different philosophers we're going to be looking at in this topic have different definitions of God. Premise 2. If God exists in the mind alone, only as an idea, then a greater being can be imagined to exist both in the mind and in reality. Premise 3. This being would then be greater than God. So premise 4. Thus God cannot exist only as an idea in the mind. So therefore, conclusion, God exists both in the mind as an idea and in reality, in order to be the greatest conceivable being. So you can kind of see how he tries to use logic throughout all of it in rationality, similarly to a deductive argument. The question here is this actually a deductive argument or is it an inductive argument? So Guanilo directly criticised Anselm because they lived around the same time. So he criticised directly by writing a letter to him using the criticism of a perfect island. So he attacked the Anselm's form from the ontological argument, replacing the word God with the greatest conceivable lost island. And it led to an argument which had the same form as Anselm's, which with true premises, and yet it led to a false conclusion. So premise 1, I can conceive of a lost island, that which no greater island can be thought of. Such an island must possess all greatness. Premise 3, it is greater to exist in reality than just in the mind. So therefore, the lost island must exist in reality. But Guanilo illustrates that this isn't the case. The conclusion here is false. He doesn't necessarily say that this perfect lost island must exist, although it might. We don't know. So therefore, this cannot be a deductive argument. And Anselm then responded directly to Guanilo's criticism with his second form. So he said, premise 1, God is the greatest conceivable being, nothing greater can be conceived. Premise 2, it is greater to be a necessary being, so cannot not be, than a contingent being which can cease to exist. Premise 3. If God exists only as a contingent being, then a greater, non-contingent being can be imagined. So premise 4. This being would be greater than God. Premise 5. To be the greatest, therefore, God must be non-contingent. So in conclusion, God is a necessary being, since no other being can have created him and cannot be made to cease to exist. So again, Anselm is using this deductive logical argument to illustrate that God must be a necessary being, whilst a lost perfect island would be a contingent being. So therefore God has to exist and has to be the greatest conceivable being because he's necessary, whilst the island isn't. It's contingent, so it doesn't have to exist. And Guanilo replies to this criticism again. So he said that it's not necessarily true. Anselm is speaking about God that as that which nothing greater can be conceived. But Guanilo is talking about a lost island, and Plantinga also pointed out that we can always think of a greater island. So for example, one which is bigger, has more trees. So an island cannot have intrinsic maxim, although God can. So Plantinga is trying to support Anselm here, whilst Guanilo's criticism. And necessary existence is part of the concept of God, whereas it is not part of the concept of the greatest conceivable lost island. So again, supporting Anselm here. So there is no contradiction in saying that the island does not exist, but there is a contradiction in saying that God does not exist as the equivalent of saying that an existing God does not exist. So they're trying to show here that there is a contradiction. And René Descartes supported Anselm's ontological argument, but he strengthened it. So he had added his own twist on it. So Descartes distinguished between a thing's existence and its essence. So he argued it's possible to determine that the essential nature of something was, which is its essence, its characteristics, independently of knowing whether it existed. So he used the illustration of a triangle whose essence was 3 angles that added up to 180 degrees. And the idea of the triangle could not be separated from the idea of its 3 angles. But that does not demand that triangles actually exist. So what he is saying here is the fact that a triangle must have 3 angles that add up to 180 degrees, otherwise it would not be a triangle itself. So that again is a necessary concept of the idea of a necessary essence of what a triangle actually is, because if you take away the angles you have no triangle. So that is the necessary aspect and his logical deductive argument here. But it doesn't demand that triangles actually exist. But Descartes could conceive of his own existence. He basically used the argument of 3 ways of doubt in order to illustrate this, and I'm going to talk you through it rather than you were having it seen on the screen. So the 3 ways of doubt was this: Descartes tried to understand how he can know his own mind exists. So he says, well, firstly, there is sense doubt. My senses aren't always reliable because they can deceive me. So for example, if I look at a straw in a glass of water, the straw appears crooked, but when I take it out, it's straight. So that illusion illustrates to me that I can't necessarily depend on my sense experience and trust it. In the same way, when I look at a building far away, it appears very small, but when I see it up close, it's very big. So again, it's illustrating that my sight or my senses aren't always reliable. The second doubt that Descartes had was dream doubt. So he said that within my dreams, they seem very realistic, as if they're happening in reality. And you can think of times where you've had dreams and thought they were real, or for example, when you have a dream and you stumble or you trip on something in a dream whilst you're dreaming, your legs sometimes move. So that illustrates the fact that your body doesn't necessarily, or your senses, doesn't necessarily know the difference between dream and reality. So that is another way of doubting. And the third wave of doubt that was a bit more wacky for Descartes was evil demon doubt. Descartes basically said, well, how do I not know that an evil demon is controlling my mind and telling me what to do? So therefore, I cannot fully trust or rely on that. It is a doubt that I have. But through that, Descartes then thought, well, I think, therefore I exist. So I am a thinking being. And if I wasn't a thinking being, then I wouldn't be able to doubt. So therefore an evil demon can't be the reason. So he eliminated that doubt, and he came up with his famous quote, cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. I am a thinking being, and therefore I exist. My mind exists. So Descartes, therefore, could conceive of his own existence, which is this bit in green that you can see. And it's really important that you do illustrate how he gets there, because that's going to give you those deeper, higher marks by illustrating why he has this doubt, because that is his deductive argument of how he gets to I think, therefore I am. So he could conceive of the existence of a supremely perfect being, and this supremely perfect being is what he defines God as. And when he considered the idea of a supremely perfect being, he argued that existence was an aspect of perfection. So in other words, the existence of a supremely perfect being was a unique case where existence was part of its essence, and therefore demanded that such a being existed. So God has to exist because perfection is part of his essence, otherwise he wouldn't exist and he wouldn't be perfect, but he is, because he is a supremely perfect being. So again, it's using that logic, that deductive argument here. So I exist. In my mind, I have the concept of a supremely perfect being. So existence is a perfection, so existence is part of its essence. A supremely perfect being must exist in order to be supremely perfect. So therefore, a supremely perfect being exists. And this is the kind of premise, conclusion part that you can also use in your essays. And here you've also got a visual representation of what his triangle argument was. So a plus b plus c equals 180, and that needs to be in order to be a triangle. And Norman Malcom also supported the ontological argument, but he again adapted it to his own strengths. So Malcom developed Anselm's second form. So he really liked the second form argument of God being a necessary being rather than the first form that Descartes adapted. So he rejected Anselm's first form since it implied that existence was a property, and Malcom did not think existence was a property. So very similar to Kant, which we'll look at later on. But the second form involved necessary existence, and Malcom did regard this as a property, and thus it was not open to the criticisms that we're going to look at Kant that he gave. So Malcom avoids the language of greatness that Anselm uses, and he instead defines God as an unlimited being. So one characteristic of an unlimited being would be necessary existence, which, since an unlimited being cannot be dependent on anything either for coming into existence or ceasing to exist. So because of this, God's existence is either impossible, since he could not be brought into existence by anything greater than himself, or God is necessary. So he says there's two things. Either he's impossible or he's necessary, since he cannot be brought into existence as he must have always existed. But God's existence cannot be impossible, because we can think of God as existing, so it must be a possibility. It's not an impossible thing. And the only thing that would make it impossible was if it was logically contradictory, but it's not. It might not be probable, and some people might not agree with the premises or think that he exists, but it doesn't mean that there's not a possibility. So therefore, for Malcom, God must be necessary and so exist, because his existence isn't contradictory. So again, it's using premise, conclusion type logic. And you can argue whether it's a-priori or a-posteriori if you want to, but it's seen for Malcom as an a-priori argument. And now we're going to look at the criticisms of the ontological argument and arguments and philosophers that criticize further than what Guanilo did. So the first one is Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas was an Italian monk from the 13th century, and therefore you can see he was a monk and therefore a theist. So just because people criticize the ontological argument doesn't mean that they are atheists. They're criticizing the logic of the argument itself because ultimately they think it's weak and other arguments might be stronger. So Aquinas said that God cannot be demonstrated through a-priori argument because it is not self-evident that God is that which nothing greater can be conceived, which is obviously Anselm's definition of God. People have different ideas about what God is, and they are able to conceive of God not existing because there are atheists. So the human mind cannot comprehend God. A non-existent God can't be a contradiction in terms because people manage to imagine a world with no God too. So Anselm's argument, thought Aquinas, only shows that many people have a concept of God, but it doesn't show that there is an existing reality which matches the concept because some people don't have the concept of God in their minds. And Kant also disagreed with the ontological argument and Anselm's logic of it. So he attacked Descartes' arguments specifically. It also applies to Anselm's arguments, both of them. So Kant challenged Descartes' view that existence was a necessary predicate, as he called it, a characteristic of God. So Kant said existence is not a real predicate. It does not add anything to the concept. So for example, and I would really encourage you to use this in an essay, you can write it word for word as this. If I tell you to close your eyes and imagine a cat that has black fur, long black whiskers, a pink nose, 2 white ears or black ears, 4 legs, a big fluffy tail, green eyes, and it exists, by me saying it exists, it doesn't add anything to the image of the cat that you probably have. So therefore, Kant's basically saying that existence can't be a predicate, it can't be a characteristics because it doesn't add anything to the concept of the thing that you are describing, such as the cute black cat over here. It can also be applied to first and second order predicates. So the former tells us about the nature of something, so for example, the cat is black, and the latter, second order predicates, tells us about the concept. So there are lots of cats, which it would depend. So it doesn't necessarily add anything to the creation or the image of the idea of God or how big God is. So it's argued that Anselm and Descartes wrongly defined existence as a first order predicate, so something that adds something to the nature of the concept of something, but it's actually a second order concept. So the fact that it tells us, about the concept itself. So first order predicates don't tell us anything about concepts, while second order predicates do. And Kant distinguished that there was a difference between the two. So existence is the property of a concept, but not of an object, which is what God is. So hence the affirmation of existence is nothing more than the denial of the number 0. So existence is not something that can be added to or subtracted from. So therefore it can't be a predicate, a characteristic, an essence that Descartes and Anselm claim that it is. So we do not add anything when we declare that it is, like I said with the cat. So in the existence God exists, the subject is really the concept of God, and the predicate exists means that the concept of God applies to something. So existence can't be a property. And the real contains no more than the merely possible. So a concept is not made more perfect or greater by adding reality. So another criticism by Kant attacked Descartes' form of the ontological argument. So it concerned the rejection of both subject and predicate, which I'm going to show you now. So if you have a triangle, then you must have 3 angles, which is what Descartes really illustrated. But Kant argued that there is no contradiction in actually rejecting the concept of a triangle altogether. Because if you reject the existence of a triangle, then you don't need the 3 angles to then say that it exists. So if you don't have a triangle, then you don't have 3 angles. And in the same way, if there is no God, then there is no being with necessary existence. So it's the fact that people reject concepts altogether. So if God exists, he will have necessary existence, but it's not a contradiction to say that such a concept does not have an actuality for Kant. But there are, of course, criticisms of Kant's argument. The first criticism is that necessary existence is actually a property of an inability to be generated or made corrupt, and Malcom supports this. And Stephen Davis argued that the existence is a great making quality, since the existence of money in reality, rather than just the concept of money in my mind, actually allows me to buy things in the real world. Because if I didn't have money in the real world, in reality, then I wouldn't be able to go and buy things with them. So really spell that out, so to illustrate that, possibly existence might be a predicate. So Bertrand Russell was a 20th century British philosopher, and he criticised the logic of the ontological argument by using the example that the present King of France is bald. So he did this by showing that statements about the present King of France can be neither true or false, because there is no present King of France. So in the same way, making statements about the attributes of God is only meaningful if there is an actual God. So statements themselves do nothing to answer this question. So he basically says that we can't apply a-priori analytic logic to the existence of God. So that's all of the A01 knowledge for the ontological argument for the OCR syllabus. So now you can take a pause of the video and see whether you can answer all these questions for A01 knowledge, and if you can, that means you know all the A01 knowledge for the exam. And now it's time for some exam practice, because practice makes perfect. So the first question we're going to look at is that the ontological argument fails because it rests on a logical fallacy. Discuss. And the really important thing to really think about in the ontological argument is the fact that, really going to look at the definition and what's specifically unique about the ontological argument. So here it's looking at the term logical fallacy. So what is that looking at? That's looking about a-priori and a-posteriori, analytic and synthetic, deductive and inductive arguments. So you really need to focus on that and analyse that and show what the philosophers also illustrate here. So for your A01 knowledge, you want to describe and explain Anselm's two forms of his argument, as well as Descartes' version of the ontological argument, because he obviously develops Anselm's. You also want to describe and explain the use of a priori nature of ontological arguments and the dependence on logical reasoning. Again, it being unique to the ontological argument, because other arguments, such as cosmological and teleological, don't have this. And description and explanation of counter-arguments such as those of Guanilo, Aquinas, Kant. And for your AO2 analysis, if you want to agree that the argument fails, you might want to give some of the following arguments. So Galileo's argument uses the analogy of the perfect or lost island, successfully highlighting the differences between describing something that thing exists in reality. And Aquinas points out the flaw assumes we all share an understanding of what God is, but the premise might actually be false. And Kant asserts the existence is not a predicate, showing the logical flaw that God's existence cannot be determined or demonstrated simply by describing his attributes. And again, these are just points that I'm giving you here. You would have to give examples and analyse it as I've gone through with you before. If you want to disagree, these are the main points that you can give. So the intention of the argument was to support faith-seeking understanding, so it has not failed in the aim that it encourages reflection on the nature of God. And existence could be a predicate of God, because although contingent existence is not a predicate, a case could be made to say that existence or necessary existence is. And it can be argued that the ontological argument does fail, but for a different reason, not because of its internal logic, but because belief in God does not arise through reasoned debate. It could be through a posteriori and, people experiencing things. So that ultimately leads you to religious experiences, cosmological and teleological arguments, rather than the ontological argument. But really be specific and see whether that answers the question. In this specific question, that would answer it. In other questions, you including other arguments might not strengthen your points unless you've already covered all the other points before, because some examiners can be pickier in you sticking to the questions precisely and answering the question itself. The second question we're looking at is how persuasive are ontological arguments for the existence of God? So for your AO1 here, you want to describe and explain the persuasiveness of a priori arguments. So again, give examples of what we went through, 1 + 1 = 2, definitions, as opposed to a priori arguments. So for example, that if their internal logic is consistent and the premises are true, then they can lead to certainty. Again, through examples that we've illustrated. The more examples you give in an essay, the more you illustrate to the examiner that you really understand what you're talking about and the points made. You also want to describe and explain ontological arguments through Anselm and Descartes. And you also want to look at the critics of the ontological argument, such as Guanilo, Aquinas and Kant, and Russell. So, if you want to support the view that ontological arguments are persuasive, then you can illustrate these arguments. And again, these are just points. As in a priori argument, the ontological argument can give certainty, which makes it persuasive. So illustrate how here. Necessary existence is a predicate which can be ascribed to God, and that successfully shows that God exists. The ontological argument sets out to seek understanding for those with faith, and it is persuasive in doing this. And if you want to reject the view that the ontological argument is persuasive, then you can use these arguments. It fails to persuade because we do not agree on what God is. All the different philosophers, different definitions of what God is. So therefore, how can it be persuasive if they're giving different definitions of God and therefore they're different ontological arguments? So which one can actually be correct? It fails because existence is not a predicate, so Kant's argument here, so illustrate that through the examples given. And it fails to persuade because arguments against the existence of God, such as the problem of evil, are more persuasive as a balance. So you can here incorporate some of your problem of evil knowledge here to show how the logic is false. And you could include Mackey here of, the inconsistent triad. And that, again, is trying to be a priori argument through the logical problem of evil. And rational arguments of any kind do not tend to lead people to religious belief, as faith is not solely an intellectual choice. So again, you can use the religious experience as being more persuasive here. And obviously with all these essays, remember to have a very strong introduction and conclusion as well, otherwise you will lose out on marks. But that's all on the ontological argument today. Join me next time for more religious studies, philosophy and ethics.